There is a meeting that happened inside the walls of this institution that nobody on the outside was supposed to know about. A room with the right people in it, a document on the table, and a decision read aloud that landed on one woman like a sentence. Camilla walked into that week believing she had survived the worst of it. The yacht scandal, the diary cuts, the staff reductions, the 5 words Anne had spoken into her face in a corridor at Windsor. She had absorbed all of it and kept standing. And then the Royal Council met, and when it was over, the title she had spent 30 years fighting for, the one the country had been told was permanent, the one she wore to Westminster Abbey in front of the world, was no longer entirely hers in the way she had always understood it to be. And the woman who stepped into the space it left behind was not somebody she could argue with or lobby against or outlast. It was Catherine. And that, more than anything else in this story, is the part that broke her. Camilla Parker Bowles married Charles on the 9th of April, 2005, at Windsor Guildhall. It was a civil ceremony, not a church wedding, because the Church of England had serious reservations about blessing a second marriage for a man who had publicly admitted adultery while still married to his first wife. The country had serious reservations, full stop. Polling at the time showed that a significant portion of the British public did not want Camilla to become queen at all. Not then. Not ever. The wound from Diana was still that raw. The flowers outside Kensington Palace in 1997 were still inside a lot of people's chests, not yet fully processed, not yet ready to be replaced with something that felt like a reward for the woman Diana had named as the reason her marriage had collapsed. And the palace knew it. So they made a promise. At the time of the wedding, Clarence House issued a statement confirming that Camilla would use the title Princess Consort when Charles became king. Not Queen Consort, Princess Consort. A title created specifically for her situation, specifically to reassure a grieving public that the woman who had been the third person in that marriage would not one day sit where Diana might have sat. That promise was made formally. It was recorded. It went into newspaper archives and parliamentary records, and it sat there for 17 years while the world slowly, cautiously, began to accept that Camilla was not going anywhere. Then in February of 2022, on the occasion of her Platinum Jubilee, Queen Elizabeth issued a statement of her own, and in it, she expressed her sincere wish that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort when the time came. The promise made in 2005 dissolved overnight, not rescinded formally, not debated in Parliament, not put to the public who had been told something very different 17 years earlier. Simply superseded by a sentence from a 95-year-old woman who wanted to resolve a succession question before she died. When Charles became king in September of 2022, Camilla became Queen Consort. And the country accepted it, the way the country accepts most things it was not asked about, which is with a low murmur that eventually quietened down. But inside the palace walls, the murmur never fully quietened, because the people who lived and worked in that building remembered the promise, and one of them had been remembering it longer and more precisely than any of the others. Anne does not forget things. That is the starting point for everything in this story that involves her, and it is important to say it plainly because people misread her as cold or distant or simply indifferent to the drama unfolding around her. She is none of those things. She is a woman who has been processing and filing and cross-referencing for 70 years while keeping her face completely still in public, and the filing system she built is one of the most comprehensive records of institutional overreach in that family that has ever existed in a single human memory. She watched Camilla erase Diana from those palace walls. We have been through that. The flowers burned, the bedroom locked, the portraits boxed and stored, and eventually forgotten in a room at Windsor that nobody visited. Anne watched every piece of it from about 4 feet away, and she did not say a word publicly about any of it, because that is not how she operates. She filed it. She watched Camilla's preferences quietly become palace policy, the way a senior royal's wishes do when the person they are married to is either the king or the man who will one day be the king. Rooms arranged differently. Staff, whose loyalty was perceived to lie elsewhere, gradually finding themselves reassigned. Ceremonial decisions made that subtly elevated Camilla's profile at the expense of the institution's connection to Diana's memory. None of it written down. None of it attributable. All of it filed by a woman in a tweed jacket who said, "Good morning," and then nothing else for the rest of the day. And she watched the title. She watched it change from princess consort to queen consort, and she watched the public absorb the change because it had come from Elizabeth herself, and you do not argue with Elizabeth. But she noticed something that most of the commentators writing about it at the time did not pause on. A wish expressed in a Jubilee statement is not legislation. It is not a constitutional amendment. It is a sentiment, a very powerful sentiment from a very powerful woman, but a sentiment nonetheless. And the formal governance structures of the royal household, the ones that determine how titles are confirmed, reviewed, and where necessary modified, those structures had not actually been updated to reflect it. That gap was not an accident by the time William found it. He had been looking for it deliberately for years. The thing people consistently underestimate about William is the patience, not the anger, which everyone can see sitting underneath the pleasant receiving line version of him if they look for more than 5 seconds. The patience, the willingness to sit inside a situation that is wrong and let it be wrong for as long as necessary, while he builds the thing that will make it right in a way that cannot be undone. He started with the Duchy of Cornwall. He took it over in September of 2022 when Charles ascended, and he went through it the way a forensic accountant goes through a company that has been run on handshakes for 100 years. Every external relationship reviewed, every undocumented arrangement identified and either formalized or terminated. Contractors who had operated on the basis of personal trust with no written agreement found themselves facing proper contracts for the first time, or no contract at all. The estate had run for generations on the understanding that certain things simply were not written down because the right people knew about them, and that was sufficient. William decided it was not sufficient, and he proved it worked. The duchy under William became a model of documented, auditable governance in an institution that had historically treated documentation as somewhere between unnecessary and dangerous. He applied the same framework to the Royal Foundation. Annual accounts published, goals stated clearly, programs that failed to deliver cut without sentiment. One former advisor described working for him as the experience of being in an organization that had decided accountability was not a threat, but a defense. And William had decided that specifically because of what he had watched happen to his mother inside an institution that ran on unaccountable informality. Now here's the piece that connects the duchy and the foundation to that council room. While he was restructuring those institutions, William's team was also conducting a quiet review of something far more sensitive: the formal governance documents of the royal household itself. The charters, the letters patent, the internal constitutional arrangements that determine how titles are conferred and under what circumstances they can be reviewed. Dry reading for most people. Exactly the kind of reading William had been doing for years, because he understood that the rules of any institution are the rules of the people who understand them best. And what his team found, buried inside the formal governance structure of the royal household, was a mechanism that had not been used in living memory, but that had never been removed from the documents. A provision allowing the Royal Council, the senior advisory body that operates alongside the monarch on matters of institutional governance, to review the conferral of titles in circumstances where the holder of a title had been found to have acted in a manner inconsistent with the obligations attached to it. It had been written into the documents in the 19th century, and nobody had looked at it seriously since. William looked at it seriously. He had been looking at it seriously for 2 years, by the time the yacht came out of the water. The Esperanza scandal broke the way important things break inside that family, which is slowly, then all at once, and at a moment when the person at the center of it has already decided nothing can touch them. We have been through the details of that summer. The super yacht anchored off the southern coast of France, the Luxembourg Holding Company, the guest list that read like a conflict of interest catalog, the routine maritime filing that nobody reads, the photograph on a private account that was deleted 12 minutes too late, the journalists who already knew exactly what they were looking at, and the internal palace rules, written by William's own team, that had been sitting in Camilla's office before she stepped on the boat. But there is a detail about what came after the scandal broke that is important here, and that most of the coverage did not slow down enough to examine. The external story was damaging. The charity accounts, the unlogged meeting, the 2023 trip that had been quietly noted and then buried by a senior official who should have escalated it. All of that was serious, and William treated it as serious. The meeting at Kensington Palace with the physical folder of documents placed on the table without ceremony, the demands for full written disclosure, the formal rejection of Camilla's office's partial response, which had no modern precedent at all. But the internal story was different, because what the review of those charity accounts actually surfaced, once William's team started cross-referencing them with the governance documents from the Royal Foundation and the broader household, was something that went well beyond one undeclared yacht trip. It was a pattern of decisions made by Camilla's office that had, over a period of several years, consistently prioritized her personal relationships with outside donors and associates over the formal obligations that attached to her title. Not dramatically, not in ways that would ever produce a criminal charge, but consistently. And consistently, in governance terms, is far more serious than once. The folder William placed on the table at Kensington Palace in September of 2025 contained the yacht documents. It also contained something else, a summary prepared by his team, mapping Camilla's office's decisions against the obligations formally attached to the title of Queen Consort, and laid out like that, on paper, in chronological order. The gap between what the title required and what her office had actually done was not narrow. William handed that summary, separately and privately, to the King's principal private secretary. And then he waited. The council meeting was not announced. It was not entered into any public diary. It was not reported by royal correspondents in advance, because nobody outside a very small group of people knew it was happening. That is how you know how seriously William had prepared the ground for it, because a meeting of the Royal Council that does not appear in any public record is a meeting that somebody worked very carefully to keep off the record until it was too late to stop. The room was at St. James's Palace, which matters. Not Buckingham Palace, which is Charles's operational center. Not Kensington Palace, which is William's. St. James's, the formal seat of the royal household's constitutional machinery, the building where accessions are proclaimed, and where the most serious institutional business of the monarchy has always been conducted. The choice of room was itself a signal, and everybody in it understood what kind of signal it was before the first word was spoken. Charles was present. That is the detail that reframes everything that followed, because Charles being in that room meant this was not a son acting unilaterally against his father's wife. It meant the king had agreed to participate in a process that concerned the woman he had spent 30 years fighting for. Think about what it costs a man to sit in that chair, in that room, at that table. He had dragged this institution through public scandal for her. He had married her when polling suggested it was still a genuine risk to the crown. He had watched his sons beg him not to do it, and he had done it anyway. He had chosen her over and over again, at enormous personal and institutional cost. And now he was sitting in the formal constitutional room of the royal household, about to participate in a review of the title he had given her. Anne was present. She had been asked, and she had accepted without any discussion. Sources suggest her response when the invitation was conveyed was 3 words: "Of course I will." No elaboration, no conditions, no request for additional briefing. She had been waiting for a version of this meeting for a very long time. William's private secretary was present, representing the Prince of Wales's household, 2 senior members of the King's household, the Lord Chamberlain, and 1 constitutional advisor whose role in these proceedings is to ensure that whatever the council decides sits within the formal governance framework of the institution. The document was placed on the table in the center of the room, not handed around, not circulated in advance, placed. William had learned that particular piece of theater from his own practice, and it worked the same way here that it had worked at Kensington. This is real. It is documented. It is not going away. You are looking at it now. The constitutional advisor walked the room through the governance provision, the 19th century mechanism, the criteria for review, the threshold that had to be met before the council could formally act. And then William's private secretary walked the room through the summary his team had prepared: the pattern of decisions, the charity accounts, the undeclared meetings, the 2 yacht trips, the obligations of the title set against the documented record of how those obligations had been met. The room was very quiet while that summary was read. Charles sat with his hands flat on the table and did not look up. Then came the question that nobody had been willing to put into words before that morning. The Lord Chamberlain put it plainly, the way formal proceedings require plainness. Was the council of the view that the threshold had been met? The silence lasted longer than it should have if the answer was going to be no. Anne spoke first. She said yes. 1 word, no qualification, no preamble, no. The same precision she has applied to everything in her life that she has decided is worth saying out loud. Charles did not speak against it. That was how it was recorded. He did not vote against the finding. He asked 1 question, which was about the form the decision would take, and he was given the answer, and he sat back, and the council moved forward. The formal decision of that morning was not a removal in the dramatic sense that word implies. It was more precise, and in many ways more devastating than a simple removal, because it could not be reversed by anybody in that room. The council found that the title of Queen Consort, as currently configured, would be subject to a formal review of its attached obligations, and that pending that review, certain ceremonial and institutional functions associated with the title would be transferred to other members of the royal household, temporarily, in the language of the document. In practice, and everybody present understood the practice, permanently. The functions transferred were specific. The patronage network Diana had originally built and that Camilla had inherited, and in many cases, neglected. The ceremonial representation roles at certain state occasions, where a queen consort's presence carries institutional, rather than purely personal, significance. The formal advisory relationship between the Queen Consort's office and the charitable structures of the Royal Foundation. In other words, the working substance of the title, the parts that gave it meaning beyond the name, the parts that connected it to actual institutional power. Those were the parts transferred. What remained was the designation, the name, the seat at state occasions beside the king, the accommodation and the staff, and the formal precedence, but drained of the content that had always given those things their weight. Camilla still had the title. She had simply lost most of what the title was for. She found out the way people find out bad news inside that building, which is not from the person who made the decision, and not in a room with adequate preparation, and not at a time she would have chosen for herself. A private secretary conveyed the outline. A formal letter followed within the hour, the language of it measured and careful in the way that formal letters always are when the institution has something to say that it does not want to have argued with. She read it once. Then she read it again. And by every account from the people who were near her that morning, what followed was not tears, and it was not a scene. It was something quieter and in many ways harder to watch. She simply went still. The way a person goes still when something has happened that they understood on some level was always coming, and that they managed, for 30 years, to keep from arriving. She turned to Charles. That is the move she has always made when the institution turned against her, because for 30 years, Charles, turning back toward her, was the guarantee that she could survive anything the institution did. She turned to him and she waited. He came to her. Nobody has described that conversation in full, and I do not think anyone should. But the people with proximity to that household in the days after the council meeting have said the same thing in different words. He held her. He told her he was sorry. He did not tell her he had voted against it. He did not tell her he had fought for her in that room. And she understood from what he did not say exactly what had happened on the other side of that table. He had let it go. Not because he did not love her. Everybody who has watched that man across 30 years of public punishment for the relationship believes he loves her. He had let it go because the one thing that was bigger than his love for her was his understanding that his son was right, that the institution could not absorb another scandal, that the paper trail William had put on that table was real and documented, and that pushing against it would cost more than accepting it, that a king in cancer treatment with a limited reserve of energy for internal battles had to choose which battles he was strong enough to fight, and this was not one he could win. Camilla had built her security in that family on one thing: Charles's ability and willingness to shield her. The willing part was never in question. It was the able part that had quietly failed, and she understood, sitting in that room with him, that the shield she had relied on for 30 years had developed a crack that neither of them could repair. She asked him one question: whether Catherine had known about the council meeting in advance. He paused before he answered. That pause was its own answer. Catherine's office moved within 48 hours of the council decision, and the speed of it told you everything about the preparation that had gone into what looked, from the outside, like a smooth institutional transition. The patronages came first. Diana's patronages specifically, the ones Camilla had inherited and that Catherine's office had been quietly mapping for over a year. The hospices, the landmine clearance charities, the HIV and AIDS organizations that Diana had walked into, when walking into them still required a kind of courage the institution did not formally celebrate. Those charities received letters from Catherine's private secretary informing them of the transition. The letters were warm, specific, and knowledgeable about each organization's history in a way that told the recipients somebody had done their reading long before the letters were written. The organizations were not surprised. That is the detail that tells you about the preparation. A charity director who receives a letter about a royal patronage transition and who is genuinely surprised by it is a charity director whose organization was not consulted in advance. The organizations that received Catherine's letters were not surprised. They had been spoken to, gently, off the record, in conversations that never made it into any formal diary. Catherine's team had been in quiet contact for months. The state occasions followed. The ceremonial representation roles that the council had formally transferred were, in practice, absorbed into Catherine's existing schedule with a minimum of disruption and a maximum of coordination that made the whole thing look like it had been planned years in advance. It had been planned years in advance by a woman who understood that the moment the opportunity came, the transition had to look inevitable rather than triumphant. Because triumphant is a headline and inevitable is history. There is a specific image from a formal reception in November of 2025 that I keep coming back to. Catherine arrived and was placed in the ceremonial position that 6 months earlier had been Camilla's. Not the seat beside Charles, that remained Camilla's and always would in the formal sense, but the working position, the one that involves moving through a room and representing the institution to the people in it, the one that requires a knowledge of who each person is and why they matter to the organizations the Crown supports. Catherine moved through that room with the specific knowledge that comes from having read every briefing document and having spoken, personally, to the people who ran the charities in question before she ever walked through the door. Camilla was present at the same reception. She sat in her designated position. She performed the formal functions that remained hers, and she watched Catherine work the room in the way that Catherine has always worked rooms, which is with a completeness of attention that makes each person she speaks to feel, for the duration of that conversation, like the most important person in the building. Nobody had to say anything. The room said it by itself, and Camilla sat inside that silence and understood what the next years of her life were going to look like. The patronages that Diana built came home. The charities that had watched their royal connection quietly neglected for a decade had a Princess of Wales in their corner again, one who had read their annual reports, who knew their chief executives by name, who showed up to their events without a press release prepared in advance and stayed longer than the schedule required. Diana used to do that. She was famous for it. She would arrive at an engagement with an end time agreed, and the time would come, and she would still be there because she could not make herself leave, a person who still had something to say to her. Catherine does the same thing. It is not performance. You cannot perform that specific quality for 2 hours in a hospice in Birmingham without everybody in the room seeing through it. It is simply who she is. And who she is, it turned out, was exactly what those organizations had been waiting for. Anne came to Camilla. That part was not in anyone's plan, and it was not scheduled by anyone's office. And William found out it had happened the way he found out about the corridor at Windsor, which is afterwards, from someone who had been close enough to hear it. She did not bring anyone with her. No aide, no witness arranged in advance, no protection officer, positioned in a way that suggested the meeting had been formally sanctioned. She simply arrived at the room where Camilla was, and she went in. Now understand who these two women are to each other before you hear what Anne said. They have shared a family for over 50 years. They have sat at the same tables, stood on the same balconies, attended the same ceremonies, and in all of that time, they have maintained a relationship that has never once warmed beyond the surface level that protocol requires. Anne has never bowed to her. That story has been told before, and it has been confirmed by enough sources that it sits in a different category from palace gossip. She asked Queen Elizabeth personally to be exempt from that particular requirement, and the exemption was granted. Camilla has spent 20 years being the most powerful woman in the building, and the one woman she could never win over was the one standing 4 feet away from her at every family occasion of their adult lives, saying good morning, and then nothing else. And Anne had her own wound underneath this one that ran deeper than most people know. The story of Andrew Parker Bowles and what his marriage to Camilla cost a young woman who had been told she was not allowed to be the one standing at the altar, belongs in this story because it is the foundation underneath everything Anne has ever done or not done in relation to this woman. She sat in the pews at that wedding in 1973 with her face arranged into exactly the expression the institution required of her, and she has not said one public word about what that day cost her in the 50 years since. So Anne walked into that room carrying 50 years of filed, compressed, perfectly controlled history, and she stood in front of a woman whose position had just been formally diminished by a council that Anne herself had spoken the first word in, and she said 5 words. She said, "It is what Diana deserved." Past tense. Deserved. Not deserves, not is owed, not should always have had. A statement about a debt that had been outstanding for 25 years and had now been settled, not by a speech, or a scandal, or a public argument, by a document placed on a table in a constitutional room at St. James's Palace, by a man who was 15 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin, and who had spent the next 3 decades quietly, methodically, patiently, building the ground that would one day make that room possible. Camilla stood there and received those 5 words the way she has received everything in her adult life that she could not argue against, which is with a face that did not move and a silence that gave nothing away. Anne turned and walked out of the room, and those 5 words were in 3 newspaper offices before the end of the week, because 5 words spoken in a private room at Windsor carry more weight than any statement a press office has ever drafted, and everyone inside those walls has always known it. So here's where it stands. And I want to be precise about this because the imprecise version gets shared and repeated, and eventually it calcifies into a story that is simpler than the truth and less honest about what actually happened. Camilla is still Queen Consort. That title was not formally removed and it was not formally rescinded, and no public announcement was ever made that it had been. She walks beside Charles at state occasions. She holds the designation. She has the accommodation, the staff, the formal precedence. The name is still there. What is gone is the substance, the working patronages, the ceremonial functions that carry institutional weight, the advisory relationship with the charitable structures of the Royal Foundation, the formal connection to the organizations that represent the Crown's relationship with the people it serves. Those are gone. Transferred, in the clinical language of the Council decision, pending a review that everybody in that building understands is never going to produce a reversal. And in a family where appearance has always been the institution, where the title and the role and the public function are the whole of what a senior royal is in any meaningful sense, the loss of the substance while the name remains is not a consolation. It is a specific and deliberate form of diminishment that leaves the person holding it nothing to push against and nowhere to direct the anger, because the name is still there, and the name is all the public ever sees. She cannot fight it in the press, because fighting it in the press requires acknowledging publicly that there is something to fight, which means acknowledging the council decision, which means the story that has been kept inside those walls comes fully outside them, and the yacht, and the charity accounts, and the undeclared meetings, and the 2 years of documented governance failures go into every newspaper in the country simultaneously. She cannot fight it through Charles, because Charles sat in that room and let it happen, and she knows now what his silence in the face of his son's documented case actually means. It means the protection is gone, not because he stopped loving her, because a king in cancer treatment, focused on conserving enough energy to continue working, is simply not in a position to sustain a prolonged internal battle against a son who holds every document, understands every governance mechanism, and has the full institutional weight of his position as heir to the throne behind every move he makes. She cannot fight it through Anne, because Anne said 5 words and walked out of a room, and there is nothing in 5 words that can be argued against or appealed or taken to a press office to be managed. And she cannot fight Catherine because Catherine did not take anything from her. Catherine simply received what the council transferred, and then went about the work of those patronages and those engagements with the specific and complete attention that makes fighting her look, from the outside, like arguing against the concept of doing a job properly. So Camilla sits with the name and watches the work go somewhere else. And she walks past Diana's portrait on the Hall of Matriarchs wall at Windsor every time she moves through that part of the castle. And she carries 5 words down every corridor in that building. And she waits for a review she knows is never coming back the way she wants it to. The question nobody inside that palace will answer is the one about what happens when Charles dies. Because the institutional support, the day-to-day working machinery of Camilla's life inside the royal household, exists downstream of one fact and one fact only. Charles is the king. When that changes, every resource, every arrangement, every decision about her accommodation and her staff and her public role gets reviewed by the man who built the legal framework that made that council meeting possible. The man who was 15 years old in a dark suit walking through central London, and who has not changed his mind about a single word of what he concluded in the months that followed. William has been very clear about the monarchy he is building. Smaller, tighter, more accountable, zero tolerance for informal arrangements that even look like conflicts of interest. There is no version of that monarchy in which Camilla's position expands. There are versions of it in which it contracts further, and the pace of that contraction will be set by a man who has already demonstrated in front of the whole country that when he decides something is over, it is completely over. The announcement, if it ever comes at all, is just paperwork catching up to a decision he made a long time ago. Diana's patronages are coming home. Her name is being spoken in official palace communications with a frequency and a depth of respect that has not existed since before she died. Her portrait stands on the wall beside Queen Elizabeth in the room where it always belonged, and the woman who spent 25 years removing every trace of her from those walls now walks past her every morning in a house she thought she had won, holding a title she can feel getting lighter in her hands. William was 15 years old when he made himself a promise. And then he did the hardest thing a person can do, which is nothing, for 25 years, while he built the ground so carefully that when the moment finally came, there was nothing left to hold it back. He brought his mother home, and then he restructured the institution around her memory so completely that undoing it would require dismantling everything he has spent his adult life building. The council meeting lasted 2 hours and 12 minutes. The decision took 30 seconds to read aloud. 25 years of waiting for 30 seconds in a room, and Camilla, standing in a corridor at Windsor with 5 words following her and a portrait watching her go, has the rest of her life to sit with the understanding that she was never, not once, as safe as she believed she was. And the boy she was afraid of since he was 16 years old finally showed her why.